So I'm just going to briefly introduce Professor Ned Rossiter. Ned has come from Sydney for this event as an affiliate of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. He's Director of Research at the Institute for Culture and Society and Professor of Communication in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University, and is currently working on an ARC discovery project, the Geopolitics of Automation, which investigates AI and machine learning operations in the warehousing sector in Germany, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Australia. The project is interested in how automation technologies change labour conditions and produce territories in ways that modify geopolitical tensions. So you can see why he is a wonderful respondent in all the topic areas we have so far discovered today. Please come join the stage here, Ned, and we look forward to your reflections.
Well, thank you very much, Melissa and Jack and the Australian Centre for Automated Decision Making, Australian Research Council Centre, and the Asian Communication Research Centre, where we are today at Nanyang Technological University, for hosting us. It's a real pleasure actually to have this opportunity. Thank you, Melissa, for making it available and Jack for me, because it's really prompted me to spend a little bit of focus time for change, reading Josh's work, which was all entirely new for me, and Henry's book. So actually, because this is new work for me, it's necessary for me to be less improvised than some of our brilliant and rather more pedestrian, I'm afraid. And I have a text that I'll need to stick to, otherwise you won't be pretty. So the industrial, actually, before I start, I just want to say a couple of things as well. And what I've noticed about this morning is that the way we use our various terms, that of course, obviously, they're inflected with different meanings across disciplines. And this implies different methods and modes of analysis. And it recasts then how we make intelligible similar objects of study. So what I see my response here as primarily is a kind of engagement with this kind of discussion on the terrain of kind of language in some ways as well. And what that means then for, building the kind of research and understanding we have of the world. So I'll start off with a few broad general comments, and then the second part of my talk, which will go for about, hopefully, definitely not more than 20 minutes, but hopefully something less, we'll move into the papers proper. The industrial model of the factory as the primary side of production has not gone away, neither as an infrastructure nor as an imaginary. Factories continue to be constructed. The number of manufacturing businesses in the United States has been steady for the past decade, sitting at around 600,000. Nicholas Deloise's book, Transportation in the Belt and Road Initiative, published in 2019, estimates there are around 10 million factories worldwide. Now, this is a figure that we take with a grain of salt. What is the expression? Salt. Yeah. I mean, I eat salt by the bucket load, so I treat my anyway. I don't eat so much sand though. Unfortunately, the top five. Now, this is the general sort of picture here. The top 5 manufacturing countries in the world. Again, we can dispute all of this. Are China, the United States, Japan, Germany, and India. The ongoing dynamic of disaggregated manufacturing and production in the wake of COVID-19 and its impact on global supply chains has resulted in a boom in factory construction. According to one financial report on Biden's industrial policy, which includes the Reshoring Initiative and the Chips and Science Act 2022, there has been a near doubling of construction of manufacturing facilities in the United States, with new factories comprising approximately 10% of all construction in 2022, up from 5.7% over the previous decade. Notwithstanding this massive growth in factories, the factory as a model for the social organization of labor is hardly reduced to the imaginary of industrial modernity and the assembly line. Indeed, the factory as a technology of social organization extends far beyond the walls of the manufacturing plant to encompass cybernetic systems of governing society and economy. The term social factory has been a significant analytical concept and organizational device for Italian political theory and feminist theory, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. In an essay first published in 1962, political theorist and philosopher Mario Tronti maintains the distinction between the factory and society is dissolved at the point when industrialism pervades as a general condition. He writes, when the factory extends its control over the whole society, all of society is turned into industrial production. The specific traits of the factory are lost amid the generic traits of society, which is interesting to think of, I thought of, in very specific details that we're hearing in Henry's work and Josh's work. In her critical study of neoliberalism in Latin America, and drawing on the earlier feminist activism of Maria Rosa Dalla Costa and Selma James, feminist theorist Veronica Galgo cements this idea with the following definition. I quote her here. The social factory is, above all, and even as a condition for the functioning of capitalism itself, an image of the totality of a system of valorizing resonances at the level of being itself. Arguably, then, the social factory conditions the possibility of platform capitalism. The computational techniques of organizing data generated by social relations to produce a commons from which value is extracted requires, in the first instance, a systematic valorization of labor, both waged and non-waged. This is what the social factory as a model for the organization of society within integrated world capitalism describes, to borrow a term used some years back also by Felix Portaria and Alias. Processes of globalization instantiated the integration of markets and circuits of production. Platform capitalism builds on these foundations and can be likened to a land grab, where proprietary systems expropriate the work of the commons to make data a commodity form with transactional value across interoperable systems. Josh Lepolsky's paper on water stress induced by climate change and its impact on the security of semiconductor supply chains is a critical study for policymakers, manufacturers, and consumers. It's quite stunning to read in Josh's paper, which I had sent to me prior to this, which is a more, of course, detailed account than the talk we heard just now. Josh's paper notes that up to 49% of semiconductor manufacturing facilities are located in basins with forecasts of either high or extremely high risk water stress by 2030 and 2040. Josh's paper then can also be read as an empirically informed account of a land grab, a plundering of common resources that conditions the possibility of chip-fueled capitalism. How, one wonders, might this fact of climate change not have been central to planning and financial considerations by producers of semiconductors? Isn't profit over at least a midterm outlook a primary concern of these industries? And how come policymakers are not sufficiently attuned to such forecasts with massive implications to their national interests? Such oversight suggests just how far environmental concerns are from the cognitive horizon of both industry and governments alike. And perhaps this is indicative of the short-termism that prevails for both quick profits and rapid election cycles, respectively. The two regions identified for semiconductor manufacturing in Josh's study are Taiwan and the US Southwestern Desert. The former of these I've always experienced and understood as a region with quite high and above average rainfall. So I read the article by Josh with a curiosity about how these two very different geographic regions compare. I also wondered what network dynamics means in this context. But Josh, it's the extent to which, and I quote him here, to which individual firms are connected or disconnected from other firms operating in the same global production networks. Importantly, these relations condition risk to overall network resiliency, as well as to individual firms within the network. This approach is further extended to incorporate topological analysis, which we heard from by Josh here, identifying key points, nodes, or hotspots of potential network fragility or failure. Like the immensely detailed and finely argued book by Henry Wai-Chung-Yong, Interconnected Worlds, Global Electronics and Production Networks in East Asia, Lepolsky notes that semiconductors are a critical link within and between global production networks for many classes of goods that contain ICT components, yet are not typically themselves understood as electronic devices. Josh also notes the tendency for the literature to focus on specific firms or prevailing conditions at a sector level, while there's less work done on scenario modeling of possible futures. This temporality of knowledge production may be something more specific to social science disciplines, and I suspect is less prevalent in certain STEM disciplines. I'm more familiar with work on speculative futures in disciplines and fields such as media arts, science fiction, anthropology, architecture, and design. Josh brings obviously a geographic perspective to the task of mapping the impact of future water stress on semiconductor manufacturing and its impact on distribution networks. He suggests that it's precisely the network logic of semiconductor production across global sites that manufacture and assemble component parts of chips that result in vulnerabilities extending beyond individual firms or specific regions or locations. That's to say, even prior to distribution through global supply chains, the production side of chips carries its own complexities further amplified by issues of water stress. For Tamura Burki, Intel's circular economy approach to the treatment of waste includes conservation and treatment of wastewater. What sort of scale does this need to be at to address the sort of issues canvassed by Josh? And what are Intel's plans for the location of chip manufacturing facilities with regard to water resources? Critically, Josh foregrounds how environmental conditions are foundation to the manufacturing of chips. And in so doing, he departs from the usual script of manufacturing, which would focus on the political economy of industry and states. Though Josh also inverts standard political economic approaches, which assumes a determining force on how the world is what it is. Instead, Josh, if only in passing, notes that water stress risk, in the case of Taiwan, arises from a combination of ecological and political economic factors. Political economy, in other words, is a contributing factor in the supply of water, but water resources are also a determinant in the shaping of political economy. Given the dire forecast set out in Josh's paper, I wonder what this meant for Henry's assurance that, and I quote from the last chapter, Henry, now of your book, that, but it's a theme across your book, that the overwhelming presence of East Asia in the total number and capacity of semiconductor fabs by the late 2010s will likely reinforce the macro region's central role in electronics global production during the 2020s. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Henry's network approach examines intra-firm and interfirm activities across different national economies and subnational regions. In my first monograph, published in 2006, I also examined network logics, but in a quite different way. I took the network form of digital communication as a social technical architecture, culture of practices, and politics of movements that constituted new institutional forms as organized networks, something that resonates to an extent with the thesis of Cory Doctorow's latest book, which Josh summarized at the end of his talk. If I were to transpose that idea to the study of semiconductor production, the key element of such research would include the social dimension of global production networks, most immediately manifest as labor power, but also as political subjectivities expressed in ways that contest operations of capital and the authority of the state. This is the idea also of the social factory canvassed at the start of my response. And in fairness, Henry notes these are not issues or areas of focus in his book, but of course you indicate this is scope for further research towards the end of your book. The US CHIPS Act of 2022 is part of a wider renationalization or reshoring structural shift in the manufacturing sector following wider global supply chain disruptions experienced during the peak COVID-19 years of 2020 and 2021. So-called friendshoring is a variation of this dynamic in which like-minded states create a consortium to facilitate the distribution of production with a view to securing and stabilizing manufacturing and supply. Henry's book doesn't address the structural dynamic of friendshoring as such, but it is clear that reshoring efforts, particularly in the US and Western Europe, are futile due to high labor costs, which are canvassed earlier this morning, and an absence of dedicated supply ecosystem, which this study shows is a definitive feature of supply chains in the East Asian region, with extensions across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Presumably, that doesn't mean that the exploitation of labor is a good thing, wherever it lives and works in the world. Josh started his presentation and concludes his paper by noting that much of the policy attention focused on systemic risks to global semiconductor supply chains is framed in terms of classical concerns over the geopolitics of interstate rivalry. The configuration of geopolitics in ways not reducible to interstate rivalry or contests between civilizational cultures has been a focal point of critique and empirical investigation in the various projects Brett Nielsen and I conducted with friends and colleagues over the past 15 years or so. In projects such as transit labor, logistical worlds, data farms, and more recently packet politics, we've investigated how territoriality and geopolitics are reconfigured through global supply chains, communication infrastructures, media systems, labor mobilities, and automation technologies in facilities such as warehousing. In each instance, distinct spatialities are produced and at times overlapping while other times divergent. Accompanying the spatialization of capital, states, firms, are temporal regimes of production and the governance of social relations, such as just in time, or with the advent of COVID and ongoing disruptions to global supply chains, just in case modes of production, storage, and accumulation of inventory. There are also temporalities tied to the experience of labor and life, enmeshed within machine logics of operation. These are all elements, processes, and conditions that also comprise the scene of manufacturing, whether we're talking about semiconductors or any other commodity object. How do such spatial and temporal logics figure within the Asian region? Indeed, how do they reconfigure Asia? And what is their impact on electronic manufacturing industries? For a number of years now, our collective research has been interested in the idea and material instantiation of China beyond China. At its most legible level, this idea registers historically in patterns of migration, and in more recent years, infrastructurally through developments such as the Belt and Road Initiative, which ties the geographic and national territory of China to other global spaces in ways that resonate with earlier imperial cartographies of colonial empires. Such forms of infrastructural imperialism include Chinese telecommunication firms Huawei and ZTE, as they extend their 5G networks and data centers into parts of Europe, Latin America, Africa, and the Asia Pacific, prompting concern by the US, as we know very well, and other state actors and agencies around CCP-backed cyber espionage and security issues. Josh doesn't go so far as to say that we are doomed. But the short story is that the world is set to enter a technological dark age, an imminent breakdown and collapse of social and economic infrastructures in the next 5 to 15 years. That's assuming it hasn't first fried half its global population with temperature increases and starved enough of the rest with massive reductions in agricultural production. Another possibility, of course, is total war that decimates millions. It's really hard at this point not to jump into bed with the nihilist accelerationists and sit back to watch capital eat itself while the planet burns. So for all the ascendancy of lead firms, regardless of the spaces they straddle in the world, their hegemony as entities that supply the electronic circuitry of global capital amounts to little once this world is drained of water and cooked by climate catastrophe. The brief was keep it bleak.
All right.
This looks basically the thesis that Josh kind of concludes with, but doesn't say explicitly. I didn't see any way around that.
Technically, we have time for.
Sure.
So I really liked that you drew us back to the militarization dimension to this, because it's something it's very common to say that one must reconfigure the two things that you mentioned that are contributing to the problem of short-term investments. So you mentioned that the electoral situation, which is encouraging policymakers to push down the road consideration of their planning decisions. And you also mentioned the short-term rewards that CEOs are chasing, particularly on the stock market, in order to keep shareholders happy. But what they all seem to share right now is this narrative about competitiveness, and they don't really need economic competitiveness. They need military competitiveness when it comes to AI. So I just wondered whether that might be something we need to keep live in the discussion, because it does seem to me that one of the things that's extremely unhelpful when so much is at stake ecologically and environmentally is the costs of war on those measures too. And if everyone in these different institutions is singing from the same songbook on why we need AI, which is for military defense and superiority, we're still in the same framing for research and development investment for high-tech that began when Silicon Valley first offshored, and a lot of operations were to Taiwan. So they're just some thoughts that we're talking about. Others are welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, and yeah, really interesting response to a couple of really fantastic talks we've had this morning. We really appreciate it. Just to first pick up, one of Mel's themes there. I mean, one of the things I think is really interesting, and perhaps a little bit in the background of what we're talking about, is just how far back the shift to production in Asia goes with semiconductors and before that transistors. So we're really talking about the 1950s onwards, and we're talking about the semiconductor industry in the United States, Fairchild, so before pre-Intel, offshoring to Hong Kong and elsewhere in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s. So there, as Josh said, in those kind of key texts that we're looking at now about this current situation, the chip war book being a really classic example, yes, it is very striking that there is no discussion of climate change and the issues we're talking about now. There is quite a lot on why those moves happen. There is a lot there about it, and it's very, very striking that it is all about labor. It is all about labor. It's entirely driven by that. And there is a huge differential.
There were environmental concerns in the days when Fairchild came to Hong Kong and Singapore, but mainly for chip assembly and logistics.
Yes.
So there were environmental concerns in Silicon Valley. So there was some books published. About early 2000s.
Oh no.
On the 1960s story.
Yeah.
It's not just labor.
I realised that I was sort of going to Chris Miller's argument about why. I'm sure
there were many
you're right about that. There's a lot else there.
Before Chris Miller.
Yeah, just to think, I think that's right. There certainly were, but he emphasises the relative productivity and the female labour force, and very much the institutional background in which unions and workplace organisations was not occurring. So I guess you asked those rhetorical questions. How could they do this? We do actually have quite a lot in the historiography about this problem. I think.
Well, my question was really not.
Yeah.
My question was, how could the industry and government policy sector not be attending to these now?
Yes,
to these two obvious variables.
Yeah.
And one of the beauty of Josh's paper and analysis is its simplicity. And he's totally upfront about that. And it says, here are two data sets. Why haven't they been brought together? When we bring them together, what do we see? We see an insane business model in one sense, like, who would be so nuts to plow millions of bucks into the assembly of the manufacturing side?
Millions.
Right,
Well,
thanks.
no, exactly.
And sort of not be kind of attuned to the fact that, yeah, okay, you've got a kind of limited kind of business model there as well.
And so the story is about the path dependency,
Mhm.
which is why, why Henry's explaining why the strategies which we're seeing right now, by the change, some not all, some of it are actually most unlikely.
Right, they're pretty tight fixed.
Yeah,
Hence
yeah.
my sort of
We're
conclusion that I could sort of actually, if we weren't being recorded, I'd be describing it in other terms. But, like, then what's interesting is that, there's two quite extremes, it seems to me, in terms of analytical method going on here. Joshua's work gives us that simplicity. Henry's on the other side gives us the incredible complexity and diversity, and of course, you're both dialoguing with each other, collaborating, so on and so forth. So it's not like you're not aware of it. But you could break it down to this real micro level of the huge complexity around networks of manufacturing. And those two approaches then give you quite different conclusions and outlooks and scenarios. Yours is 20, 30, 40, this next decade, we have this kind of consolidation of East Asia as the kind of hegemon, if you like, of manufacturing in the chip sector. Whereas Josh is saying, well, is that a pipe dream? He doesn't say that. And I'm not saying Josh is rude, but if I was rude and I was Josh, if I was a rude Josh, I would say, but how is that even possible if we're basically the model of 2030 and 40 says they're pretty indistinguishable. They're both the same.
Maybe let me come in a bit because on Josh's thing, Josh and I had a very long discussion on this. Because as you know, I pass over some of my data at the back to him to do this analysis. So then we were both talking about, and since Mel is here, maybe you got to give us some insight from Intel. Is that we were talking to each other, right? How is it that so many fabs are located in such water risky watershed? And then I was saying, yeah, but I never asked my interviewees, you knowing me, know that this area is either water risky or short of water supply. And then why are you still developing either new facility or refurbishing existing? So then I was saying, but then, at that time I didn't know that this workshop was forthcoming. So I didn't know that I would have someone from Intel I can talk to. And I was saying, I'm sure TSMC, if people in Intel and TSMC, they have research team who would have done all this necessary. They know exactly that there is not huge water supply. But maybe they found a way to model this in such a way that commercially is viable. For example, pricing. I don't know, I'm just speculating. I say TSMC, knowing very well that Taiwan has water shortages. They may not have a secret document with the government that always give you priority in water supply, but they know that worst scenario, they can price over ordinary people. Now in Singapore, as you know, I mean the visitors here, we in order to make 10% of those chips, we have to drink our own urine. No. What I mean is that Lee Kuan Yew explicitly developed alternative sources of water supply to this country. Yeah, we used to dependent on 90% of Malaysian water. Now it's down to only like 30% because we then have reservoir development, many more. And then we have desalination plants, and then we have the drinking urine means new water. You heard of the new water initiative. We have water, which is from dirty water reverse osmosis, and it's drinkable. That's why I say in order to make chips, we drink our urine in that sense of the word. So that will be something that is almost like to me, like a state capital market, if I want to use that kind of the economy terminology. But in my discussion with George, I still thought that, people in TSMC surely know this. Surely know the scenario. This data is public as well. I'm sure Intel will be the same, Samsung will be the same. So it's almost like asking Samsung the same question, right? Doesn't Samsung and SK Hynix, which is the other big memory maker in South Korea, we know that there is a Kim Jong-un, which is only like 100 kilometers away. North Korea can destroy all of your fabs in South Korea, with some missiles, and hence 50% of those memory chips will become basic. So the point is, why are they doing this still? So I see, I don't know, I mean, if some of you have that. So basically, Josh and I both cannot answer that question, but we suspect the firms themselves, or if you want to use capital, must have some reason for doing it, even though the fabs are located in risky areas, environmentally risky. That's what the scene is. Yeah, because if you and I know today, they must have known 20, 30 years ago.
If I may add very briefly on this, I don't know exactly about the South Korean case, but I think for the Taiwanese, I was in National Taiwan University, so the other NTU,
Yes.
a few months ago, and for administrative task. And then I was listening to the president talking about. So I think I think one of the reasons is not just pricing. Okay, it's also political priority. So now National Taiwan University are saying we have such a successful model to train engineers for TMSC. So all the other units, I was there for journalism in the units institutional review, said you should learn from them. Okay, so it's, from that I got a sense like they're also political. You are the #1 priority of the Taiwan government. So we will give you, even though there's a drought, we will. Exactly,
National defense.
Yeah. So for the political, it's like definitely, more than just pricing.
But then it's more recent, right? If you think of TSMC 10 years ago. Yeah, so when it's almost, let me see, now count back maybe 8 years ago, when TSMC then tied up with Apple and installment in my book, that makes the, and today's, the A chip is used to be sanction making. And that must be the major risk. Because to do that, today Apple is 25% of TSMC business. Okay, so it's a single biggest customer.
Right.
But the point is, 8 years ago, that switch from Samsung to TSMC, and hence future demand for all the water electricity, they must have taken that into account. It's kind of, and that wasn't geopolitical at that time. Because if it's geopolitical, you would have done it back in America.
Right. Yeah, but then because they're in the main facilities are the fabs are in Hsinchu.
And it's
So
minus now.
Yeah, Hsinchu, and I think there's their continuity, from the Kuomintang government era to now. I think they're giving this as a, even though they're a change of the ruling party, but that's something consistent in the so even before TSMC, recently there was a HTC and earlier. So I think it's that they're all highly water consuming, right?
Right, you were thinking saying something, so.
Yeah, I like the bleak ending because I always want to have a bleak ending, but I defer to utopian endings, which is the easy way out. But I recently read this book by Jonathan Crary called Scorched Earth, which is like even bleaker than you.
Yeah, no, he's good on blue.
And at a certain point he says, I'm tired, and hopefully we've heard the last of the famous sentence from Frederick Jameson that says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And he says that because of this kind of sustainability issue, capitalism will end in 30 or 40 years. So it has this vision of environmental concerns bringing into capitalism rather than labor struggles, which seems to me quite problematic as a kind of scenario for reasons that people have been suggesting. But at the same time, I'm also sick and tired of this. It's easy to imagine the end of the world kind of thing, which is sort of where you end. So I'm just kind of wondering if you can go a bit bleaker.
Oh, go bleaker. You believe in the end of the world. Yeah, no, well, I mean, look. Well, we don't see Labor dealing with, you know, addressing its conditions very well collectively under, you know, ongoing exploitation that centuries of that history. And no, I mean, I took Josh entirely seriously in his paper. And he basically says it's not feasible to have all of this construction and facilities going on because they're not going to work without water. And then the path dependencies haven't been quick enough to flip around to, I don't know, what, shifting up to, you know, Russia or, you know, the melting ice caps of the world, whatever is needed for manufacturing these chips. That, yeah, so it looks totally hopeless. It's fascinating. Like next 5 years will be a really, really rapid ride. That's for sure.
I think as we wrap up for lunch, the other thing to bear in mind is that the word sustainability does not threaten business as usual. It is often used in the context of these discussions in corporate life to maintain business as usual.
Sure.
So that's why it is how can we maintain this status for how we are faring now and prolong it for as long as possible. And so it's a very different way of thinking about who benefits from something being sustainable. And what we're looking at when we only focus on water is only one part of what an assessment of sustainability now currently values. And so the short answer to this big picture is that we have to understand that there are other risks that are seen to be worse than the worst that are being prioritized too.